Hello and welcome to the fandom track here at ConTinual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we are talking about the legacy of the Twilight Zone. But before we start, let's have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Carole.
Hi, I'm Carole Stokes. I'm a longtime science fiction fan, both print and media, and I'm really excited to talk about such a classic show.
Awesome. Jeannie.
I went ditto what Carole said, except that I'm Jeanne Adams.
And Jim.
Oh, am I supposed to ditto? Yeah, I'm Jim Nettles. I write science fiction, urban fantasy, bit of horror, bit of this, that, and the other, as well as a bunch of nonfiction stuff. And Twilight Zone is probably one of the reasons I write. That should disturb everyone.
Yeah, I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. I write epic and urban fantasy as Gail and urban fantasy male paranormal romance as Morgan. And I definitely cite Twilight Zone up there with Dark Shadows and the original Star Trek as why I'm here today doing this stuff. So let's fess up. When did you discover Twilight Zone? Jeannie?
Oh gosh, probably about the time I discovered Dark Shadows and my brother's heavy metal rock music. And I was preteen probably, and just thought it was awesome because you and I've talked about this, Gail. I'm a big Dark Shadows fan too. And Twilight Zone is just so thought-provoking on every level. You're just like, even as a kid, you're like, whoa, that's freaky. And then it starts you thinking, and the rest is history usually.
Yeah, this is true. Jim?
Way too young, because
Yeah.
being a fiend and never sleeping anyway, even as a young age, I was probably 7 or 8 years old and watching, up in the middle of the night, watching reruns of Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, in any number of the old anthology shows. So yeah, I got into them way early.
Yeah, I mean, I got into Dark Shadows as a preschooler. No idea what mom was thinking about that. And Twilight Zone, the same sort of thing. Elementary school, definitely. So yeah, there were things that went over my head, but surprisingly enough, the show works on so many levels that even as a kid, you get parts of it. And I have never trusted department store mannequins after that episode. Just never. And one time I was at an event in a high rise, and part of the high rise was under construction. And for some reason, they didn't have that floor blanked out of the elevator. So the doors open on this floor that is dark and under construction. It's like, oh, hell no, I have seen that episode. I know the mannequins are there. I'm not getting out. You're like, closed door, closed door, closed door. So yes, I side-eye mannequins to this day. Carole?
Well, Twilight Zone and I were born in the same year, so I did not watch it live. I started watching it in 6th grade when I also started watching Dark Shadows. But I'd started reading science fiction by like 3rd or 4th grade. And when I stumbled upon science fiction and realized there was stuff like that out there, that was life-changing. So I had already been reading a lot of sci-fi. I was dabbling in horror. And to find a show that encapsulated so much of that visually and thought-provokingly was like a watershed moment. And yeah, watched it ever since. Outer Limits. Watched Night Gallery, when that came out. That I love that kind of anthology where you don't have to. You just want to have that kind of microcosm of event and thought and twist. So yeah, it's a classic, and many things have tried to be it, and some have done well and others have not, but nothing can just touch, it's the mothership.
I'm right there with you on Night Gallery. I love that one too.
There's so many in all of those, Outer Limits and Night Gallery, that they hold up in the sense of the question they're asking. I mean, some of the like space ones, land on Mars and the indigenous people are going to, welcome us with open arms. Yeah, no, not so much. But some of the other ones, the time travel ones, or the, not the deal with the devil ones, or the be careful what you wish for ones, are all so like, oh, that's creepy.
Well, what are some of the other episodes that have stuck with you all these years? Not that we haven't seen, reruns in between, but what are the ones that really stick in your mind? Jeannie?
Oh my gosh. The creature on the wing, the
With
airplane
William
wing.
Shatner?
Every single time I get an airplane, I'm like, it doesn't matter that was decades ago. Doesn't matter that it was goofy as hell when you look at it again. It's always like, something out there. And there's another one, the store mannequins, you mentioned that one. That one still gets creeps. The one with the open door, the one where the town is empty. I think that's in season 3. Because I went back and looked at a bunch of the seasons one time, but it's where the guy wakes up in the middle of town and the town is empty, and it's his town and he recognizes everything, but there's no one there. And then the other one that always comes to mind when I see World War II era movies, there's a World War II era one where the pilot crashes and he wakes up and it's 40 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very, it's very thought-provoking.
Is that the one where he's trying to get his men to safety and he doesn't realize they're all dead?
No, that's another one.
And he won't, and his resolve to get them to safety is what's keeping their souls from moving on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That one's pretty creepy and thought-provoking too. And really sad.
Huh?
And really sad too.
Yeah. Yeah. Jim?
I mean, when you start looking on, well, what's your favorite Twilight Zone? The ones that, I mean, number one, you've got Shatner in several episodes. So, I mean, you've got the one where he's sitting there, not only the one on the wing, but the one where he is absolutely overacting. And even the woman he's playing against is like, oh my God, you're an overactor. But he's going and hitting the little, the devil to get his fortunes, and going and running around town and watching that, the old trope of how you're going to create the self-fulfilling prophecy. But some of the ones that I love the most, because I mean, so much of the time it was about mortality and life and balance. Two of the ones that really always stick with me is, number one, the one with the kids and mom, and they jump in the swimming pool and come out on the other end in the old fishing hole. And, it's kind of that take on almost Peter Pan. Yeah. And that thing of, I don't want to grow up, I don't want to be responsible, and how that works. But the other fun one that balances that is Kick the Can Down the Road, with all the old folks sitting in the retirement community, and ultimately they all sort of get to become kids again for a night before facing that mortality. And some of those things had such a great degree of hope at times, and other times it was very much you're still going to you reap what you sow. And I think that was always kind of the beauty of the stories that stuck with me, were the ones that came out in a twisted way of having some hope.
Yeah, Twilight Zone definitely taught you to be careful what you wish for, and that anything you wished for could be terribly twisted into something you didn't want. I think two more that set out to me, the real classic is the guy who is in the library after the apocalypse, and then his glasses break. Yeah. That one is just, especially after the last several years, you think, yeah. Where would I be without my glasses? And then there was one with a dollhouse, and the humans were the dolls, and there was a giant alien kid that was playing with them, not very nicely. Yeah. And that one was sort of freaky. Carole, how about you?
One of the things that I liked was the way it would look at different perspectives of reality, like what is real, what isn't real. So for instance, like what you just talked about is a real, they think they're real, but they're not. Are they really just being, you know, toys from the alien? Or the one, 5 characters in search of an exit, where there's like these 5 disparate people. You know, there's a soldier and a clown and a ballerina, and, you know, I forget what the other couple were, and they're trying to get out of something, and they like can't get out of it. And one of them they're finally able to get one of them out of it, but then he's gone, and they're like, now what, you know? And then it turns out that they're really the dolls, they're little girls' dolls,
They're
you know, in the toy bucket or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
But to them, they're completely real, you know. And so things like that I really liked. And the way, and I think one of the things that we're all kind of commenting on that stands the test of time is not so much even the quote unquote sci-fi stuff like landing on Mars, but the morality questions that are posed by those situations. Where they think, what's the neighborhood one? And the guy builds the bomb shelter, and then they're worried that the alien is coming, and then everyone's trying to get in his bomb shelter, and they're literally begin killing each other to try and get in. And then they decide he's the alien, and it's horrible.
Yeah.
And yet it's timeless, because we're seeing this play out on our news headlines,
Yeah.
essentially. So there's these kinds of morality questions that it doesn't matter if it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Those questions are valid questions and are always ready to be observed and looked at afresh.
Mhm.
And I think that's one reason we always find that appeal in a lot of these episodes, because these actors may be long gone and this is black and white film, but you know what, we're still asking these things and we still have to think about them.
Well,
Well,
that's
it's
one
a
of the
great,
things.
yeah, that's a great segue into what's made this so enduring. And we didn't even arrange that.
No,
I mean,
I really didn't.
what are your thoughts?
Well, I actually, what I was going to comment on is that there are so many movies and television programs which have paid homage to those, either through an episode or through, I mean, you know, Twilight Zone has nothing on, you know, the Winchester boys, but all of those sort of morality questions of, what if you wish for that? Have you thought about the consequences? If you build a bomb shelter and your neighbors aren't building bomb shelters, have you thought about the consequences if something really happens? And I mean, everything from Jordan Peele's Out to, you know, like half the episodes in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, they all have those kind of enduring questions about humanity. What exactly are we doing? What's honor? What's good and right versus what's evil? And what is belief? You know, where do we believe something? And are there truly things that we don't understand and don't know about? And do we need to leave space for that? And I think, like Carole said, that's sort of one of those enduring themes that continues to play. And I know it's affected my stories and the way I write is, how do we leave room for that? How do we leave room for the monster on the wing of the plane to be real? What if it is real? How do we deal with that?
What if it's real and we just can't see it?
Yeah. And somebody else can. Do we believe them or not?
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the things too is, I mean, because it is a product of its time, but I think by the nature of the fact it was a subversive product of its time.
Oh, by a long shot.
And the fact of it was always on that just edge of, why are we allowing this stuff on? Wait, people are still watching. And the fact it is inspired so much. But to me, it was the fact that it was always, everyone asked just a very direct question and made you contemplate it. It kind of played it out sometimes to the level of absurdity. Sometimes it took it and played it and said, okay, this is going to be fun. It wasn't week after week. It was not going to create existential dread, but it might. But this week, you know, okay, last week was existential dread. And this week is, well, you know, hey, great. I wound up in heaven and I'm hitting the slot machine every week and I do nothing but win. Well, this is boring. Who said this was heaven? You know, I mean, the classical Billy Mooney sitting, you know, sending people to the cornfield. Having grown up in a fairly rural area, I was sitting there going, there's some people I could send to the cornfield. But I think it was the fact that a lot of the time it went and it asked a fairly simple question and took it beyond the logical conclusion and explored it in a way with often people that felt very real versus a lot of time what we get now with actors today, which is, oh, we've got to create the complicated story behind it. We've got to, you know, it was just a very simple morality play. And I think that that's one of those things that creates those enduring stories is they were so well done.
Well, and I think, you know, I love that you brought up the cornfield one, because maybe city folks don't get it, but if you grew up around cornfields, and especially if you've seen the cornfields out in the Midwest that go on forever, getting zapped into the middle of a cornfield with 8-foot or 9-foot tall corn, you are not going to easily find your way out, even if you follow the rows. And you're going to be sliced to hell by the time you do, because those leaves are sharp and they draw blood. You do not run through cornfields. So yeah, totally terrifying. You could be stuck there for a very long time. Now, we brought up how it was in some ways a product of its time. Well, what isn't? Right smack in the middle of the Cold War. Are there any episodes you can think of that maybe haven't weathered the time as well? Although everything old seems new again. So I'm not sure that question plays out the way it might have a year or two ago. Any thoughts on that? Any that didn't translate, or they're just, wow, this is very 60s, not in a good way?
I assume we're going to go past the actual physical things. We're like spaceships and
just popping open the door without worrying whether there's oxygen or not. Yeah.
Technicalities. I think when we look at a lot of the ones that were reflective of the time of war, you know, because we saw so much stuff that was based in the Civil War, because you still had a few people left that remembered that period of time. You had people that very actively remembered World War II in Korea that had been there. I mean, so many of the actors that portrayed and played in so many of these roles had been there. They'd been in war. I mean, this is one of the big influences that Rod Serling had himself, was those experiences. I think when you look at and question, you know, what has not stood the test of time, I can't think of a question that was asked in any of these that hasn't necessarily stood the test of time. I think there's some of the things that we might question in terms of the standards and how the question was asked, but the questions themselves, I can't think of anything, you know, like and I'm trying to remember the name of it. You know, if we look right now, there's such a backlash against people of wealth. Well, there's always been some of that, but I mean, you know, the one in the library with the attorney, and oh, well, if you can survive this, you know, what are you willing to do to gain wealth? And I think that is a question right now that, depending generationally, is a really interesting question. What are you willing to do to achieve this? Are you willing to sacrifice, you know, age or beauty or whatever the question may be? But that's also one of the oldest questions in the book.
Yeah.
I kind of find the ones that aren't asking a real question are the ones that don't stand up. I mean, if they're asking a question about who's good, who's bad, who should survive, what is your moral imperative here? Are you seeking the right kind of, you know, lifestyle or avenue or whatever? Those, because that's a really universal question, those stand up regardless of the trappings. Whereas maybe some of the more, I mean, like in Supernatural, we would refer to them as the monsters of the week, you know, don't. So like Talking Tina, it's kind of like, okay, yeah, it's a horror trope kind of thing, but it's not something that you're going to get a lot of deep meaning out of, you know. And so those are, to me, those are the ones that are a little more disposable in, you know, at this point. I like the ones where even if it doesn't seem like it's a meaty concept, but it really is as you're thinking about it. those are the ones that then really engage regardless of how much time has passed and what the actual physical trappings of that story are framed in.
Yeah, I mean, like the ones that allude to existential dread of war with Russia are just so passé. Oh, wait.
Yeah. Yeah. I think some of the space ones, even setting aside the crazy trappings that we all now know won't work, I think some of the ones that they almost verge on a slightly racist bent, I think they don't hold up. It's like,
Or colonial.
Colonialism and racism. You see a couple of those, and those are the ones that make you go, no,
Yeah.
click. And that really, to me, that was the only place that they ever sort of hinged over towards being really unpleasant. And I think they did not do a lot of things to expose those parts of the times that they were in, the late 50s and 60s and so on. But in the space ones, where it was a little safer to be, put something or someone as the bad guy, there were some racist overtones to those. So I don't think those have held, and colonialism, I don't think they've held up very well. And yet we still need to ask ourselves those questions.
Well, I was going to say, I think that often in those, it's, again, that's kind of what I was alluding to. The questions that are asked often are still valid questions. I think it's the answers and the conclusions we come to now are very different.
Right. Well, and I think, it's one of the questions of probably our era, is we know there's stuff out there. We know there's stuff in our atmosphere. The government's finally admitted it, literally. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to handle that. And we've done it a lot in fiction, first contact stories and first contact movies and all those sorts of things. But how are we going to handle that? There was a show, a very short-lived one-season show, the pandemic makes the time blur, called Debris. And it asked a lot of those questions. How do we handle these things that may come from first contact, and what is that going to mean? And so it too is sort of a homage to the Twilight Zone.
Well, I looked it up, and the Twilight Zone had more than 150 episodes, and Rod Serling wrote over 80 of them. So, that's an awful lot coming from the mind of one person, which then, of course, also comes from one person's value systems and insights as well as blind spots. So, and I've read about him being almost kind of manic in, like, not sleeping for days at a time and just cranking out one script after another in kind of a white heat. So there's, I'm not sure that given the production times, they also had a whole lot of turnaround or eyes on script. It was like, here, ripped it out of the typewriter. Here we go. We got the script for today. Which probably saved some of the more controversial episodes from not being just axed.
Well, and I mean, that's a little bit like what you see with Orson Welles and a lot of the radio play production, because they were so high volume. You got to have it today. We're going to turn this around and then we're ready tomorrow for the next one. And because there was such a dismissiveness about anything that was considered in that science fiction fantasy, oh, that's for kids, trope sort of thing. I think there was a lot of things that were allowed to fly and did not necessarily get the review. And I would argue that that's part of the problem we see with some of the tries of reboots of Twilight Zone, is that they are so commercially polished.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think when we look at the Twilight Zone especially, but a lot of the cheaper produced anthology shows, was look at a lot of the time the actors that they brought in. You got to see fundamentally people that were, I mean, so many of them featured that Southern actor, Southern accent, deep South, or that Midwestern, very deep Midwestern. Hey, we just went and plucked them out of that place and we're going to have them do their bit and return them to wherever from whence they came.
Which is a Twilight episode in and of itself, right?
Which is a Twilight episode in and of itself. I've got a story to go right this afternoon, but I think that there's an essence there of having seen people that were still in some ways in that transition from the radio play days into acting and TV. It was that whole, yeah, nobody's ever going to see this again. It's going to get aired once or twice and let's move on.
Right.
I think that created a possibility in storytelling that we would never get today.
Right.
Not in the same way.
Not in the same way. Well, and they didn't have to answer to multiple advertisers the way they do now.
Mm-hmm.
The soap operas were called soap operas because the soap companies, so what, there were 4, maybe 5. Now you might have 12 manufacturers promoting during commercials in one episode of a sitcom or a drama or whatever, and so you've got to answer to all of them for whether it's good or bad. And so, as Jim says, it gets polished more than it might have. And Carole, you were talking about the earlier, you were talking about it, how it's almost like a short story, and the sort of the novel serialized things, what they would do several things during an episode. And it is like short stories. It's like those bites of things. And so they dealt in broad stereotypes in order to make the story work best. And, Jim, you alluded to it. Yeah, they plucked the Midwestern, farmer out and say, do your bit on screen, because he was a stereotype. And everyone in the audience could go, yeah, corn-fed farmer from Idaho is in his cornfield. What if he had the power to zap someone into the cornfield? But you already knew who that person was just because of the stereotype. And I think that both helped them and limited them.
Well, and also, for what it's worth, this was before the CBS Rural Massacre of the late 60s, where they took all the shows off that were set in the Midwest or on farms. Green Acres, Petticoat Junction, all of those shows, they axed in one season because they wanted to go after an urban audience that they thought would be more profitable. But at the time, we're still looking at an America that had more of a population in rural areas than in cities. And that shifted over time, but that's not where they were in 1959 when the show started.
Mm-hmm.
So that was more familiar personally to a lot of the viewers. What's the legacy of the Twilight Zone? It seems, if you really look, it has fingerprints on so many things. I keep thinking, Carole, of the episode of Supernatural where Sam gets stuck in a town where the mayor has decided the 1950s were just swell, and he's going to make sure everybody is just swell too, and nobody's allowed to not be swell. And Malt Shop and Cardigan and roar.
Of course, and then even the one with Lilith, when big bad uber demon Lilith takes a vacation as a angelic looking blonde child who can zap people into the cornfield. I mean, that's absolutely right where she comes from. As soon as I'm watching that, I'm like, oh, it's Billy Mooney in the cornfield.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of Supernatural had Twilight Zone over.
Absolutely. There's no way with the kinds of stories they were telling that they couldn't not draw on.
They had the compendium sitting there going, all right, let's see this
This
week.
worked for them.
And the other huge one for me would be Buffy.
Mm-hmm.
There's sorry, inarticulateness, in eagerness. there's fingerprints all over Buffy. I Sing the Body Electric. The Ted the robot, who's the perfect father. Oh gosh, there's so many instances of it that Buffy turned and made it their own, but they couldn't have built what they built in Buffy had they not had the foundation of the Twilight Zone. You can't, so many things that you can't have built, couldn't have built, because you couldn't have envisioned it until it was envisioned in the Twilight Zone, because people just didn't even kind of think that way. The science fiction writers thought that way.
Yeah.
The general public did not think that way. because the general public is not necessarily out there in the 50s and 60s reading Asimov and Niven and Pohl and all these people. But the Twilight Zone took those concepts and that mindset, created it in a way that then the general populace could watch it and absorb it and be affected by it. And those people grew up to be our creators and directors and writers that we have today. And their views are infused with that kind of background.
Yeah, I think Twilight Zone and Philip K. Dick had a huge influence on the period. Jeannie, what do you think? Where can you find the fingerprints of the Twilight Zone?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think you can find it all over television in the 80s and 90s and well into today, and the horror movies as well. I mean, I mentioned Jordan Peele's Way Out. I mean, there's all Twilight Zone's fingerprints are all over that. And he's even said that. Deep Space Nine and Next Generation, The Strange New Worlds. Yes, it was influenced, and the foundation is the original Star Trek. But some of those episodes, I would argue, were probably influenced by Twilight Zone as well. And
or actually
Outer
written
Limits.
by some of the people that wrote some of those Twilight
Same, yeah,
Zones.
same
Exactly.
writers.
There was
So-
meshing of gears there.
Overlap in the writer's room.
Mhm.
And I think too, because each one of them saw the other one's success, they would pull something from there and go on. And, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, but I think that so much, Carol's already mentioned Buffy and Supernatural, but even that show I mentioned, Debris. I mean, there's so many things within that show. For instance, I liked it because it had so many of those elements. And I think that any show that is operating in a liminal space like Supernatural or Debris or any of those, or even any of the Star Trek movies or television programs, is asking those same kind of fundamental ethical, moral, morality play questions, as somebody said earlier. I think it was you, Jim, that it is a morality play. Which is right, which is wrong? Which door are you gonna go through? How long are you gonna pull the slots out of the machine before you get bored? Are you Q? How long until you get bored and go play? So yeah, I think it's all over.
Jim, what about you?
I mean, I think you can look at definitively the influence in a lot of places. We were talking earlier about, all the five in the toy box. And if I remember right, there was like the barrel on the street because they were collecting for, kids in the holidays sort of thing. Well, when you look at that, that's Toy Story. You can almost map it to Toy Story. We talked about Talking Tina. Well, that became Chucky. That became, I forget what the name of the horror movie is that recently came, but I mean, that kind of, you could say that comes behind a lot of the haunted doll craze. I think you can look at, any number of stories, and I mean, it's hard to miss seeing those imprints. But again, it wasn't like, and I mean, a lot of these were ideas that I think that Rod Serling and Twilight Zone cemented into our culture. But I mean, he too was grasping from the old Greek, Roman, the old myths. And I mean, but I think that because it was so early in the TV era, it's what cemented these views and these caricatures and these tropes for us, because now a lot of things that I would say are tropes, he at least had a definite influence in cementing them as a trope.
Yeah, and I look directly at things like you mentioned, Night Gallery. Hey, James, glad you could join us. Had some technical problems. Things like Night Gallery. I don't know how many people remember Trilogy of Terror, but I was fundamentally scarred by that, especially the Karen Valentine one with another killer doll and that knife. Yeah. Forget about anything else.
I had to learn to not watch those alone when I was still in junior high and stuff, because I'd be like,
Well,
and Outer Limits, and there were a whole bunch of shows, I think like Night Stalker and some of those that were episodic and didn't have necessarily an overarching season theme. They were essentially strung together short stories with consistent main character and location. And
Well, I think even Lost in Space stole
Yeah.
from Night Gallery and Twilight Zone, because there didn't ever seem to be a longer thread. It was never really a plot there. It was just, oh, look, we have another episode of Lost in Space. And I
Yeah,
think
but
they stole liberally from
but Billy Mooney never got to send somebody like into the space cornfield. I was really disappointed.
just out with
He could have gotten rid of Dr. Smith so easily.
no, I know.
Well, and it's interesting because I think we see echoes of some of those one-shot morality play episodes in things like Doctor Who. So which came first, the Twilight Zone or Doctor Who? Well, they originated around the same time. We've been watching a lot of Korean paranormal dramas, and it's very clear how much American culture influences the Korean shows, especially since everybody eats at Subway all the time. I'm not kidding. But a lot of the episodes, they are one shots where main character of the week learns a lesson. Main character of the week must confront their sins. Main character of the week must let go of a grudge. And there's often a twist, and you're wondering, well, there was obviously a lot of cultural interplay there with the relationship between the United States and South Korea. Surely people saw these shows. How much of that is taking that approach and making it something new from the culture itself? But I look at it and go, oh, that could have totally been a Twilight Zone episode. James, welcome. We are talking about the legacy of the Twilight Zone. And so tell us, if you have a couple of favorite episodes, one or two favorite episodes, tell us what they are, and where you see Twilight Zone having made a cultural contribution, or where you think its fingerprints still show up.
Oh gosh. I probably have a top 10 easy of just favorite episodes that I like equally. But my go-to is always Time Enough at Last, the Burgess Meredith episode about the guy with thick glasses and he only wants to read, and then there's a nuclear war and he's got time to read now, but then he breaks his glasses. I think anybody, I'm an eyeglass wearer, I think anybody that wears glasses has that horror of breaking their glasses, especially as a kid when I first saw it. So there's something kind of very visceral and emotional in that. As far as the legacy, I think we're seeing it now with stuff like Black Mirror and Love, Death, and Robots, just that anthology format. And telling an emotional, tight story in like 20 or 30 minutes, and getting that reaction, be it a morality play or something just kind of straight horror, which Black Mirror and to some extent Love, Death, and Robots tries to do a lot. I think that's the lasting impact. Even if we don't get another Twilight Zone type show, people who have been raised on that stuff are now creating these things, and they carry that.
I'm always amazed that it's not just people who might have seen them in reruns when they were kids or might have watched them over time, but thanks to Disney's Tower of Terror, everybody who's ever ridden the ride at Disney Studios gets a nice little introduction from a Rod Serling lookalike, which is kind of creepy because I know they did that after he actually died, and it's a really good fake.
It is a really good fake. It's scary.
It is. But in this haunted hotel that is tricked out to the max, and so it lives on in some of its newest incarnations because that's introducing it to a whole new audience who were born long after it ended production.
Well, now you also even have, of course, with the streaming services, we've seen this in Supernatural, where Supernatural, began when people who are younger than the show are fans of the show because it's streaming. And if you go to Pluto, they like have a Twilight Zone channel. That's like all they show is Twilight Zone. So even people who had, were not even a glint in their father's eyes back then, are able to grow up watching it and absorbing it within themselves, even within the context of this modern age and everything, and it's still having that impact. It's still affecting them. It's still, takes your mindset and like goes 45 degrees.
Yeah.
So because of streaming and everything, you just have this constant new audience for this material.
Well, and I think it's also funny because mid-century modern, which is what a lot of us just called furniture when we were kids, is now the kind of retro chic. And of course, Twilight Zone plays right into that too, with its 1950s and early 60s vibe. And, there's a whole lot of WandaVision that comes right off.
Oh, yes.
So fantastic. The
That whole
Starburst clocks. Who
series.
doesn't remember the Starburst clocks,
Yeah.
Who didn't
Just say
have?
no to bell bottoms. Just say no to bell bottoms. And anything encased in Jello. That's all.
Yes.
Every once in a while on Facebook, you get these things where it's like somebody's found this like old, 1950s cookbook, and it's like the Tower of Hot Dogs, or
Yeah.
some of these really abysmal recipes, and you think, how did people even survive eating this crap?
It's true. Jim, you were going to say something.
Probably not productive, but when I look again at the era, that period of TV, and even going beyond Twilight Zone, because I think Twilight Zone, when we compare it to some of the other anthology shows around the time, like Outer Limits to me was kind of that next step down. It pushed it a next level, but it also didn't quite have the same production budget. It didn't have quite the same writing, but I think that it still carries a lot of that same weight. But Twilight Zone, very specifically for that period of time, brought in and allowed people to come and question their reality. It was allowing them to question culture in a period of time where you really weren't allowed to. And I think the fact that those that were the kids of that period of time, because that's how allegedly it was marketed to, was, well, this is science fiction stuff. Nobody's going to know or care anyway. I almost regard it as being the same influence on so much of what we have now in terms of media and culture. Just like you could say that, in many ways, you could look at the Marvel universe, and even going back to the first round of Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi ones, created the current culture we have now around comics, comic books, and comic culture. And I think in a lot of that revival is what lets us take a look at mythology, legend, and some of the same questions, just in a new and a different way. But I think that when we talk about, well, this is foundational work, Twilight Zone truly was foundational work because of the period of time it was done in, and the fact it was a period of time that TV technology was still trying to explore what were they going to be able to do and get away with.
Yeah. Well, and like comics, which later came under fire, at first nobody cared because they were for kids. They couldn't possibly be important or talk about important things because they were just picture books for kids. And later people went, did you see what's in those picture books? And tried to put the horse back in the barn. James, we're coming close to wrapping up here. Any other thoughts about the Twilight Zone's legacy?
I don't know. I think just in general, what I was saying before, my internet crapped out again. The people that were raised on that stuff, or even like me, saw things in reruns. And I was also a big fan of the 1985 incarnation of the Twilight Zone. I have that first season on DVD. There's some fantastic stuff that came out of that one. And anthology shows like Amazing Stories, which was on about the same time. Like I said, these people that were raised on this stuff are the writers and producers and directors of today and tomorrow, and they're carrying that stuff with them. And even if we don't get another anthology show, which networks are always saying anthology shows don't sell, they need you need the same cast every week. I think that the way that Rod Serling told those stories, I think that resonates, and I think we will see kind of his legacy of telling little morality plays, maybe even things that couldn't get past the network censors. I think that will continue on into the future, and not just in TV, but in books too, in literature.
Building on that, what James says, I think we'll also see it on some of the streaming services who aren't quite so beholden as the networks are to some things. I think they're doing some pretty radical stuff that, it's a great time to be a content creator, because you now have places that content can go. You're not trapped by selling a book to New York, and you're not trapped by selling a story to Hollywood. Got a lot of outlets. And I think we'll see more of that kind of questioning sort of format, because there are some places that would be open to it.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that is kind of a beauty of where we're at now, is exactly that. If somebody wants to write their own story, and if nothing else, grab a phone and go out and film it. It may not be the best quality in the world that's 4K, 8K digital, but you can do something that's the same level and quality as a lot of the time what they had for Twilight Zone and stuff of that era, and actually better video, better audio, because at the end of the day, what people care about is the same exact thing. Tell me the story and let me connect with the people that are experiencing it, so I can see it through their eyes. And I think that's part of the beauty of where we're at now.
And I think when you look at some of the writers besides Rod Serling, Alfred Hitchcock, Harlan Ellison, David Gerald, so many people who have gone on to many other things, Earl Hammer, Greg Bear, you just scroll through and you're saying, it's kind of a who's who now, but they weren't then.
The actors and actresses are too. It's very funny to look at some of the shows and go, wait, they became, this person, Elizabeth Montgomery, became Bewitched. Oh my God.
I saw one really early one recently, and there was military because there was soldiers, but they were like, there was an alien, and anyway, and I'm watching it and I'm like, oh my God, that's Martin Sheen. Like, the babyest Martin Sheen you've ever seen, but he has a distinctive face regardless of his age. And I had to IMDb it, and sure enough, it was baby Martin Sheen. Well, it's really fascinating to pick some of these people out now sometimes and go, oh, there they were.
They got their start on
infancy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look at the number of people that just in Star Trek that were on Twilight Zone. You had Shatner, you had Nimoy, you had, if I remember right, DeForest Kelley was. If I remember, there was a long list of people that all, even if it was just some background actor, you're sitting there going, wait.
Yeah.
Especially when you catch them in a role where they're just a background actor because they're nobody important yet.
Yeah, they're a walk-on.
Yeah, going back to some of the other authors, Theodore Sturgeon, Ray Bradbury. I mean, it really does read like a who's who now.
Yeah.
But
and Andre Norton did not contribute directly to the show, but if you know her body of work and look at some of the stories, you can see that they borrowed liberally from her work.
Yeah.
And like I said, Harlan Ellison, of course, Harlan Ellison, that's a perfect Harlan venue.
Well, and I think the other place that's interesting to play against here was Hitchcock, because he also had his anthology series. And, but look at the very different styles between the two of them.
Oh, yeah.
And the kind of stories that each was willing to tackle, because Hitchcock, I don't think was as willing to stretch in some of those places.
Mm-mm.
He would get,
Mhm.
I mean, he was like, here's my niche. I'm happy going for it. It keeps paying the bills. And
And
I
he
can
did it
talk.
well.
And he did
And
it
he did it
well.
well.
He created that suspense. He created that air, but he didn't have that same stretch, or at least we didn't see that same stretch. He
Mhm.
built that brand. He went for that niche and was very happy there.
Mhm.
Versus, I think, like Gail, you were talking earlier. I mean, when you look at the history of Rod Serling, when you read about his life, he was a frenetic creator. He had to create, and that was more important often than, I think, stuff hitting the screen. It was, okay, I've got to get this idea out of my head. And I think it was a perfect combination of addiction of, I've got to feed the engine and the engine's got to feed me.
Yeah.
I also think that the difference between Hitchcock and Serling is Hitchcock gave you dread and, suspense and all that, but nobody did that existential kind of crisis, that deep emotional dread of, oh my gosh, I'm the only one who sees this,
Right.
like Serling did.
Yeah, Hitchcock is who did it, and Serling is why did they do it?
Yeah. Well, folks, we've blown through our time, of course. So thank you all for being here. And James, thank you for the Herculean effort of tackling.
Thanks for putting up with me.
Yes.
It's been crazy today.
But before we end, let's go around and let everybody say where we can find you online, starting with Jeannie.
You can find me at jeanneadams.com. You can find me on various social media platforms, including Twitter, which I spend way too much time on. It is a hive of scum and villainy, but I still spend time there. And you can find me here on ConTinual quite a lot as well.
Thank you. James.
You can find me at jamespalmerbooks.net. I'm also on Patreon, patreon.com/James Palmer. I'm on Twitter at Palmer Writer. You can find me all over Facebook. All the things, all the things the kids are doing these days.
Okay. And Jim.
You can find me at jamesbnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the speculative fiction academy.com. You can find me, kind of scattered around social media. And of course, here at ConTinual, where occasionally they let me out of my cage to play.
How about you, Carole?
You can find me on Twitter as true_firesign10. I'm a fanfic writer, and all of my fiction is on AO3 under firesign10. And as Carole Stokes, I'm here on Facebook. I'm in Gail's Supernatural TFWNC group, and here on ConTinual.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. Add a .com to those names and you'll find my websites, all of the social media sites. There's some variation of those names. So as long as you spell them right, you'll find me. And but most of the time I'm here on ConTinual. So thank you all so much for spending time with us. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more fandom coming up on ConTinual. So we'll see you online.